The knock came just after the last lamp in the house went dark. 3 slow raps, deliberate, like the person on the other side already knew Silas Ward wasn't asleep. Silas froze halfway to his bed, hand still on his suspenders. Folks didn't knock past midnight in Dry Willow unless something had gone terribly wrong, or terribly right, and in Silas's life, the second option rarely showed its face. He waited. The wind hissed across the empty plains. The knock came again. Silas grabbed the rifle propped by the doorway and stepped across the creaking floorboards. Moonlight spilled thin through the window slats, lighting dust motes drifting like tiny ghosts. Before he unlatched the door, he whispered to himself, "Ain't no one supposed to know I live out here." He opened the door an inch. A man leaned against the post, barely upright. Tall, gaunt, wearing a coat torn across the chest where something dark still bled through. His hat hung by its string, chin tipped low. "Help, me," the stranger breathed before collapsing forward into Silas's arms. Silas stiffened. The old, familiar dread crept down his spine. "I don't have anything like that," he lied. The stranger shook his head. "I saw your name on the old deeds. I worked for Redwood after you left. When word spread that the syndicate found out you were still alive, he swallowed hard. They sent hunters." Silas pulled away. "I walked out on that life. Everything in it. But you're still the rightful owner," the stranger pressed. "And they want your signature, or your death, to open the last vein under the mesa." Silas felt the walls of the cabin closing in, pressing him against the memories he'd locked away. He remembered boardrooms filled with cigar haze, men shaking hands over land they'd never seen, workers dying in shafts while profits climbed. He'd hated himself for being a cog in that machine. That's why he'd left everything behind: money, influence, the power that corrupted so easily. Now it had found him. The hoofbeats faded, then resumed, farther off. Circle riders. Silas faced a choice he'd sworn never to confront again: give the stranger up and protect his hard-earned anonymity, or shelter him and face the men whose greed could raze Dry Willow to the ground. He opened the door a crack. A lantern flickered on the ridge. More lights joined it. The stranger tried to rise. Silas pushed him back down. "Stay still, unless you want your insides spilling out." Outside, a coyote yipped, answered by another closer than it should have been. Not coyotes. Riders signaling. Silas clenched his jaw. He could run. He could abandon it all again. But the ranch, the quiet life, the tiny smiles he shared with townsfolk, it was more home than luxury ever had been. He grabbed his coat and hat. "I'll face them," he muttered. "But I'm not doing it alone." He turned back to the stranger. "Who exactly is coming for us?" The stranger's face paled. "The Black Point regulators." Silas's heart stopped. They were the syndicate's deadliest enforcers. And they were already on Dry Willow soil. Silas extinguished the lantern with a sharp breath, plunging the room into thick shadow. The stranger's warning rattled inside him. He'd worked 10 painstaking years to fade from every ledger, rumor, and memory tied to the Redwood fortune. To Dry Willow, he was just a quiet rancher whose cattle never wandered far and whose past stayed buried deeper than his fence posts. But the hoofbeats kept echoing over the hills. "You need to leave," Silas hissed. "If they followed you, they can't find you here." The stranger, still pale from blood loss, grabbed Silas's wrist with surprising strength. "Ain't me they're chasing. It's the map. The one you hid." Silas stiffened. The old, familiar dread crept down his spine. "I don't have anything like that," he lied. The stranger shook his head. "I saw your name on the old deeds. I worked for Redwood after you left. When word spread that the syndicate found out you were still alive, he swallowed hard. They sent hunters." Silas pulled away. "I walked out on that life. Everything in it. But you're still the rightful owner," the stranger pressed. "And they want your signature, or your death, to open the last vein under the mesa. Silas felt the walls of the cabin closing in, pressing him against the memories he'd locked away. He remembered boardrooms filled with cigar haze, men shaking hands over land they'd never seen, workers dying in shafts while profits climbed. He'd hated himself for being a cog in that machine. That's why he'd left everything behind: money, influence, the power that corrupted so easily. Now it had found him. The hoofbeats faded, then resumed, farther off. Circle riders. Silas faced a choice he'd sworn never to confront again: give the stranger up and protect his hard-earned anonymity, or shelter him and face the men whose greed could raze Dry Willow to the ground. He opened the door a crack. A lantern flickered on the ridge. More lights joined it. The stranger tried to rise. Silas pushed him back down. Stay still, unless you want your insides spilling out. Outside, a coyote yipped, answered by another closer than it should have been. Not coyotes. Riders signaling. Silas clenched his jaw. He could run. He could abandon it all again. But the ranch, the quiet life, the tiny smiles he shared with townsfolk, it was more home than luxury ever had been. He grabbed his coat and hat. I'll face them, he muttered. But I'm not doing it alone. He turned back to the stranger. Who exactly is coming for us? The stranger's face paled. The Black Point regulators. Silas's heart stopped. They were the syndicate's deadliest enforcers. And they were already on Dry Willow soil. The first shot shattered the porch post. Wood exploded across the room as Silas ducked and dragged the stranger off the floor. Another bullet cut through the window, scattering glass like icy rain. The hoofbeats thundered now, no longer distant, no longer a threat in theory. The Black Point regulators had arrived. Silas crawled to the corner and peered through the broken window. For riders fanned across the yard, faces hidden behind black scarves, rifles gleaming under the moon. Their horses snorted clouds of steam into the freezing air. One man raised a torch. No, Silas breathed. Burning the ranch would reveal everything: his life, his secrets, the stranger's presence. He loaded his rifle with trembling fingers. A decade of peace had softened his hands but not his instincts. He fired once, catching the torchman in the shoulder. The flame flew into the dirt. The regulators scattered, returning fire. Bullets punched through wood, leaving raw holes in the cabin's ribs. The stranger groaned but tried to sit up. Don't, Silas ordered. We can't stay here, the stranger whispered. I know. Silas scanned the room. The root cellar, hidden trapdoor under the rug. If they could drop into it unnoticed, maybe the regulators would assume they'd fled into the hills. Silas dragged the rug aside, lifted the plank, and helped the stranger descend into the darkness. Before climbing down, he surveyed his home. The quiet mornings. The worn rocking chair. The carved horse figurine given to him by the widow across the creek. Everything he'd built to forget who he'd been. The regulators closed in. He dropped into the cellar and sealed the trapdoor just as bootsteps hammered across the porch. In the cramped darkness, Silas and the stranger breathed shallowly. Dust drifted from the ceiling with every shake of the cabin overhead. The regulators stormed through Silas's belongings, knocking over chairs, overturning boxes, smashing jars for sport. One voice, cold, sure, cut through the noise. Spread out. He's here. I want the map and I want the traitor. Silas recognized the voice. Clay Barrow. Former syndicate partner. The man who'd vowed Silas would never stay hidden. The cellar air tightened around Silas like a fist. Clay was the last man he'd ever wanted to face. Then, silence. Bootsteps stopped directly above the trapdoor. Clay's voice softened, almost amused. Found you. Silas gripped his rifle. If Clay opened that door, there'd be no escape. Only blood and the truth Silas had buried for 10 long years. Silas held his breath as Clay's boots rested on the trapdoor. Dust sifted down like the cabin itself was trembling. The stranger leaned against the dirt wall, clutching his wound, whispering something Silas barely caught. "Why'd you leave?" the stranger asked quietly. "Back then, with all that wealth?" Silas kept his voice low. "Money was killing more people than it was feeding. I didn't want blood on my hands anymore." The stranger's eyes softened despite the pain. "Then why help me?" Silas considered the question. It wasn't because he trusted the man. It wasn't even because of the buried guilt he carried. It was the memory of a miner years ago, a boy no older than 16, begging Silas to shut down a dangerous shaft. The syndicate had refused. The boy died 2 days later. Silas had never forgotten his mother's scream when she learned her son wasn't coming home. "I helped because no one helped him," Silas whispered. "And that's something I can't undo." The stranger nodded, fingers trembling as he reached into his coat. Silas tensed, until the man pulled out a small tin locket. He pressed it into Silas's hand. "My brother," he said. "He died working one of your mines, before you left. You shutting down the company stopped others from dying. I thought you should know." Silas closed his hand around the locket. The gesture struck deeper than any bullet Clay Barrow carried upstairs. He felt something human, raw, and unexpectedly grounding, an old wound finally facing daylight. Above them, Clay spoke again. "Burn it." Silas's heart dropped. The regulators slammed outside, gathering tinder, shouting orders. The cabin groaned as flames licked the outer walls. Heat seeped through the floorboards. The stranger's breath quickened. "We're trapped." "Not yet." Silas pointed to a narrow tunnel at the back of the cellar, a passage he'd dug long ago for storms and rattlers, never imagining he'd use it to escape men instead of nature. He helped the stranger crawl into the darkness. Smoke crept down after them, curling like fingers around their legs. Behind them, the cabin roared into an inferno. Ahead, the tunnel's exit glimmered with faint night sky. Silas paused at the threshold, feeling the heat pulse behind him and the cool wind beckon from outside. Hope and danger, balanced on a knife edge. They had one chance. Silas tightened his grip on the locket. "Stay close," he whispered. "This isn't finished." The tunnel spat them out behind a rocky rise half a mile from the burning house. Smoke spiraled upward, turning the moon copper. Silas knelt beside the stranger, who gasped through gritted teeth. "We can't outrun them," the stranger said. "They'll track us." Silas nodded. "We're not running." He scanned the plains. Clay and his men clustered near the blaze, silhouettes dancing orange in the firelight. Their horses waited tethered by the well, Clay's black stallion front and center. Silas's jaw hardened. Clay wasn't just hunting him, he was hunting control, the old empire, the last vein under the mesa. If Clay opened it, men would die again. And Silas had walked away once already. Not tonight. Silas stood. "Stay hidden. No matter what you hear." Before the stranger could argue, Silas strode down the rise. Step by step, he emerged into the torchlight. Clay saw him first. A slow smile crept across his face. "Well," Clay drawled, "the ghost returns." Silas said nothing. He approached until only 20 paces separated them. "You burned my home," Silas said quietly. Clay shrugged. It was in the way. Rage rolled through Silas, but he didn't let it lead. "You want the last map," he said. "But you'll never get what you're after." Clay lifted his pistol. "Oh, I think I will." Silas didn't reach for his rifle. Instead, he held up the locket. "Look at what your mines did," he said. "Look at the cost." Clay laughed. "You think I care about miners? About boys crushed under stone? You walked away from power. But I didn't." Silas's voice sharpened. And that's why this ends tonight. Clay fired. Silas dove behind the water trough. The regulators fanned out, returning to old habits, surrounding, squeezing, killing. But Silas knew this land better than they did. He dashed behind the barn ruins and fired, dropping one rider. Another charged, but Silas took out the horse's bridle, sending beast and man tumbling. Heat from the burning cabin cast everything in flickering madness, shadows running like devils across the yard. Clay advanced, steps measured. You can't win. Silas raised his rifle. I don't need to win. I just need to stop you. Their final shots cracked like thunder. Silas hit Clay square in the chest. Clay's pistol dropped first. Then Clay himself, sinking to his knees, eyes wide with disbelief before collapsing face first into the dust he once sought to own. Silas staggered, breath ragged. Behind him, the stranger limped forward, leaning heavily on a rock. It's done, the stranger whispered. Silas stared at the burning remains of his ranch. Not yet. Weeks later, Dry Willow rebuilt his barn plank by plank. The stranger, now healed, rode east to warn others of the syndicate's collapse. Before leaving, he pressed the locket back into Silas's hand. Keep it, he said. A reminder of the right thing you did. Silas stayed, quiet, resolute, alive. The man who'd once been a hidden millionaire chose something richer, a life earned, not inherited. Years later, folks would say that when the sun set just right, you could still see the shape of his old cabin's chimney against the sky. A final ember of a past burned away, glowing faintly over a man finally free. Final shot line, Silas stood alone in the twilight, hat brim low, the locket glinting like a tiny sun in the palm of his hand.